In the freezing winter of December 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but the Blitz still tore through the streets below. Night after night, Britain endured destruction without relief. London burned as German bombs shattered civilian neighborhoods. The Luftwaffe pounded the industrial heartlands of Coventry and Liverpool with relentless force. Smoke, fire, and rubble became part of daily life. On the world map, the British Empire still looked immense. Imperial pink stretched across nearly a quarter of the globe. From afar, Britain still appeared powerful and unbroken. But inside the underground war rooms of Whitehall, appearances no longer mattered. Britain's leaders knew the truth they could never admit publicly. The empire was not just bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding to death financially. Winston Churchill sat beneath the streets of London, writing one of the most important letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. The fate of Britain depended on its words. Churchill was a master of language and knew the power of persuasion. Yet this letter required something far more difficult than rhetoric. It required humility. He had to tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Britain was broke, completely and utterly broke. The admission cut against everything Britain represented. This was the empire that financed the 19th century. The workshop of the world that had defeated Napoleon now stood on the edge of insolvency. History had never seen such a reversal. The letter outlined the strategic situation in painstaking detail. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships and strangling supply routes. Britain was being slowly cut off from survival itself. Churchill described Britain's desperate need for destroyers and aircraft, but the letter's most painful line came near the end. Britain was running out of money. The British Treasury, he wrote, was nearing the point where it could no longer pay cash for supplies. Without cash, there would be no weapons. Without weapons, there would be defeat. The British people would fight on, Churchill promised. They would endure bombing, shortages, and fear. But endurance alone was not enough. They could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. This was the central dilemma. This was not diplomacy. It was a plea for survival. It was an admission of insolvency. This is the historian's lens, where we examine historical events as they unfolded, guided by evidence, context, and consequence, not myth or nostalgia. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history reached this moment, we must examine the economics of total war. A system as unforgiving as the battlefield itself, a system designed to consume nations whole when the war began. In September 1939, Britain was still a financial giant. Its gold reserves were vast, and its overseas investments enormous. London remained the nerve center of global finance. British citizens owned railways in Argentina and copper mines in Chile. Major industrial firms across the United States were British-owned. On paper, Britain still appeared wealthy. Hitler's war, however, was different from anything before it. This was a war of machines, not men alone. It devoured resources at an unprecedented scale. Steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber were consumed faster than economies could replace them. Entire industries existed only to fuel destruction. No empire was prepared for that pace. Britain's greatest weakness soon became clear. It had to import almost everything it needed to survive. Food, fuel, and raw materials all came by sea. Those supplies had to cross the Atlantic. German submarines hunted relentlessly. Each sinking tightened the noose. The blockade of Europe severed Britain from its neighbors. Survival now depended on one nation alone, the United States. America was officially neutral and deeply isolationist. The public remembered the First World War and wanted no repeat. Europe's conflicts were seen as warnings, not obligations. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts to stay out of war. At their core was one unforgiving rule: cash and carry. Britain could buy American weapons only by paying cash up front. It also had to transport them on British ships. There would be no loans and no credit. Weapons would not leave American docks until gold had changed hands. Survival now had a price tag, and Britain paid it. For over a year, Britain drained its treasury shipment by shipment. Gold reserves vanished to meet American demands. Asset after asset was surrendered. In a secret effort known as Operation Fish, Britain shipped much of its remaining gold across the Atlantic. Warships carried it to Canada under heavy guard. It was the largest physical transfer of wealth in history. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The dollars were gone. The safety net had vanished. In Washington, contracts for aircraft and tanks sat unsigned. Britain could not pay for them. The empire had reached financial exhaustion. When Roosevelt read Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes immediately. If Britain fell, America would eventually stand alone. The consequences were global. But Roosevelt faced a political barrier at home. He could not simply give Britain money. American law and public opinion forbade it. Any solution had to resemble a business deal. Charity was politically impossible. Aid needed a different name. That solution became known as Lend-Lease. Roosevelt sold it publicly with a simple metaphor. You lend a neighbor a garden hose when his house is on fire. To the public, it sounded generous and reasonable. A temporary act of common sense, a friendly favor. Behind closed doors, the reality was far colder. This was not neighborly help. It was foreclosure. The man controlling the terms was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. He was fiercely anti-fascist, but equally protective of American money. His priority was the taxpayer. Before releasing a single dollar, Morgenthau demanded proof. Britain had to sell everything it could. Nothing could be hidden. He ordered a full audit of the British Empire. Government assets and private holdings alike were scrutinized. Britain was treated as a bankrupt firm. One asset became the symbol of Britain's humiliation. The American Viscose Corporation stood at the center of the storm. It was immensely valuable and highly profitable. American Viscose was owned by the British firm Cordelsies. It generated millions in income for Britain every year. Morgenthau demanded its sale. Britain resisted fiercely. The company was worth well over $100 million. Selling it during wartime would be financial suicide, but the leverage was absolute. Without compliance, Lend-Lease would fail in Congress. Britain had no choice. In early 1941, the company was seized under emergency powers. It was sold in a rushed and distressed sale. Everyone knew Britain was desperate. The price collapsed. American Viscose sold for roughly $54 million, less than half its true value. The proceeds went straight to the U.S. Treasury. Britain compensated Courtaulds in pounds at home. Internal debt increased further. This was the moment Britain understood the cost of survival. It was not a partner in the relationship. It was a debtor being liquidated. The liquidation spread beyond industry. The empire itself was now on the table. Geography became currency. Britain desperately needed destroyers to protect Atlantic shipping. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Without escorts, starvation loomed. Roosevelt agreed to provide 50 obsolete destroyers. They were relics from the First World War, but again, nothing came free. In exchange, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British military bases. Locations stretched across the Atlantic and Caribbean. Sovereign territory changed hands. The deal gave America strategic dominance of Atlantic sea lanes. Britain received aging ships barely fit for service. It was a lopsided trade. This was not a naval agreement. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Long-term power was traded for immediate survival. By the time Lend-Lease passed in March 1941, Britain was stripped bare. Gold was gone, assets were sold, and bases were leased. The treasury was empty. Publicly, Lend-Lease was hailed as the arsenal of democracy. Militarily, it kept Britain alive. Financially, it reshaped the future. Hidden in the agreement was Article 7. Britain agreed to dismantle imperial preference after the war. The economic core of the empire was surrendered. As the war dragged on, American industry exploded. Britain's economy became entirely focused on survival. Exports vanished and markets were abandoned. American companies moved into those empty markets. They supplied the war and the world simultaneously. Britain would never fully reclaim its position. Victory finally arrived in August 1945. Celebration filled London's streets. Britain believed sacrifice had been rewarded. Across the Atlantic, sentimentality was absent. In Washington, calculations continued. Power had already shifted. 7 days after victory, President Truman terminated Lend-Lease. Aid stopped immediately and without warning. There was no transition period. Ships carrying food and fuel were ordered to turn back mid-Atlantic. Cargo bound for Britain sailed home instead. The lifeline was severed. John Maynard Keynes studied the numbers and saw collapse. Without dollars, Britain could not import food or raw materials. Bankruptcy was immediate. Keynes traveled to Washington seeking a grant. He was offered only a loan. It came with interest and harsh conditions. The most dangerous condition was sterling convertibility. Keynes warned it would trigger a run on the pound. His warnings were ignored. When convertibility was introduced in 1947, reserves collapsed within weeks. Britain was forced into retreat and humiliation. The crisis was complete. The empire could no longer sustain its global role. Responsibility passed to the United States. The Truman Doctrine followed. In 1949, the pound was devalued. Britain grew poorer overnight. Living standards fell sharply. The debt endured for generations. Final repayment came in 2006. The bill lasted 60 years. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. Britain won the war and was bankrupted. Victory had a price. The United States emerged dominant. Global power had shifted permanently. The new order was set. The British Empire did not fall on the battlefield. It was sold to survive, piece by piece. If this analysis was useful, your support helps sustain long-form historical work at the Historian's Lens. Thoughtful discussion and added sources are welcome in the comments. Share this with others interested in evidence-based history.